Okay, hello again. Another tier list.
How surprising.
This tier list is going to be Dragonflight Mythic Plus dungeons across the whole expansion. Boy, do I have some things to say about this expansion's Mythic Plus seasons. We're just gonna jump right in. I'm gonna pick a good one. Waycrest Manor, A tier. The vibe of Waycrest Manor, fantastic. Love it. The bosses on Tyrannical, slightly stinky. But on Fortified, the dungeon's great. Sanguine still sucks in this dungeon, as usual, just like it did in BFA. But we don't have Quaking to worry about this time around, which is kind of rad, because Quaking Waycrest and BFA sucked, but no Quaking and Dragonflight is good. The No-Coup Defensive, Swamp Ass. Yeah, I took this tier from Max. The No-Coup Defensive, Swamp Ass. This dungeon fucking sucked. There was nothing really good or fun about this dungeon in Season 1. And the fact that so few healing specs were able to adequately make it through the healing checks on a couple of the bosses was just colossally asinine. This dungeon sucked. I'm not looking forward to it for Season 4. I hope they fix some of the problems that Season 1 had for Season 4. So, the Everbloom, S tier. Actually, I'm going to put this down to an A tier. The Everbloom is kind of a free dungeon. It's a bit of a stinker on Tyrannical, but I mean, every dungeon's a bit of a stinker on Tyrannical. Let's be completely honest here. Don't try to fucking lie to me and say that dungeons don't suck on Tyrannical. I think the Everbloom on Tyrannical, as with every other dungeon, it kind of sucks on Tyrannical, but on Fortified, it's kind of a free dungeon. There are a couple affixes that make it kind of unbearable. Bolstering. Other than that, it's good to go back to an old dungeon. Dungeon's pretty good. It's not terrible. Boy, do I have a lot of bad to say about all the Dragonflight dungeons specifically. Morazan's Rise, C tier. I think Morchi's a decent boss. I think Tyr is a good boss. I'd even stretch a little and say that Chronolord Deos is a good boss. But in my opinion, just the design itself of Time Lost Battlefield is just unforgivable. I think Time Lost Battlefield and Tyrannical is just... it's really, really, really lame. There's not a whole lot good about that fight specifically. Trash and Rise also just generally sucks. And then there's the Sonic Gauntlet, the You Gotta Go Fast Gauntlet, which is just asinine. Galakrond's Fall, A tier. Galakrond's Fall isn't all that tough and is a really engaging and cool dungeon. I really like Fall, and I mean, I don't mean that as I've farmed it a ton to get Iridol on like 4 classes. I mean that Fall is actually a really cool and fun dungeon in my opinion. The Goo Boss can suck it though. I hate the Blight of Galakrond. Halls of Valor, D. I hated this dungeon in Legion. I hated this dungeon in Dragonflight. This dungeon, like the No-Coup Defensive, had a major problem of certain classes or specs had a really, 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 really hard time, and depending on the difficulty, nigh impossible with some of the healing checks, namely on Herja in this dungeon. And it's probably worth noting, in Season 1 I was a Mistweaver main. So a lot of my experiences with dungeons per season were as Mistweaver for Season 1, Arms and Augmentation for Season 2, and Discipline and Warlock for Season 3. Halls of Valor as a Mistweaver in Season 1 was just real... It was bad. I didn't enjoy ever having to go in there for anything. Throne of the Tides, I'm going to put in C tier. I think the tuning on bosses in Throne of the Tides really sucks. I think the tuning and the design of the final hallway going towards Ozumat and Neptulon is really jank and kind of bad. Otherwise, I really like the changes to the dungeon, and on Fortified, it isn't too horrible. There are a couple points where the dungeon can kind of munch you into oblivion on Fortified, but otherwise, I think the dungeon is fine on Fort. Court of Stars. I really liked revisiting Court of Stars. I also like how they kept the Prop Pally Artifact Shield and the Demon Hunter tricks for the spy puzzle. I like how they retained the class spec role buffs in the dungeon. I think my biggest gripe about Court of Stars is routing was really weird in Season 1. Routing was really weird in Season 1. Because there were like 3 or 4 different routes you could go and like 4 or 5 different tricks you could use in total to like get after the first boss to the second boss, or even sometimes to the first boss. I think newer players as tanks not knowing or caring how the towers worked was really frustrating on the first boss. I think I'm trying to think of the name, the fell thingy, the mini boss spawner, I don't remember what they're called, spawning any of its 4 spots, and it could spawn right on top of where you're fighting one of the mini bosses. And if that happened, the difficulty ramped up for like no reason. I think if they ever bring Court of Stars back in the future, they should fix that to where the Fell Infuser mob that spawns the mini bosses, or rather calls them over to your location, I think they should be programmed to spawn after a mini boss dies instead of be able to spawn immediately. Other than that, I think Court of Stars was a really good Season 1 dungeon. Temple of the Jade Serpent. I did play other specs and other classes in Season 1. It wasn't just Mistweaver. But not a single class or spec I played. Not a single one. Temple of the Jade Serpent was not good. Temple of the Jade Serpent was easily the most scuffed dungeon that you just never wanted to see. Yeah. It didn't even really have all that good gear for like a lot of specs too. So like the only reason you ever wanted to go there was for score, and like once you got KSM or KSH, that wasn't even a really good reason to go there. Ruby life pools, D. I think the tuning on Ruby life pools overall in Season 1 was real bad. I think the mini-boss dragons, I think the bosses on Tyrannical overall, I think the mechanics of the second and final boss were just really, really poorly tuned for Season 1. Like, a 16 Ruby life pools felt like a 13 Temple of the Jade Serpent was about as hard as like a 16 Ruby life pools. A 12 Ruby life pools was about as hard as... Or no, I had that reverse. A 12 Ruby life pools was about as hard as like a 16 Temple of the Jade Serpent. the scaling was all the fuck over the place. It was not a fun time in Season 1, especially as a Mistweaver, just shit. As a Mistweaver, everything, with select few exceptions, sucked in Season 1. And speaking of one of the select few exceptions in Season 1, we have Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, which I'm going to put as a B tier for just being press W to win. I mean, there was a couple spots where Quaking could screw you, there was a couple spots where Thundering could screw you, but other than that, on Tyrannical, Bone Maw was the only boss that took forever. And otherwise, the dungeon was really just horribly undertuned. Like, a 20 Shadow Moon Burial Grounds was like a 10 Ruby Life Pools. Like, it just wasn't really that hard. Azure Vault, I'm going to put in C tier. I think the skips trivialized a lot of what made the difficulty on a Fortified Azure Vault, and the bosses on Tyrannical Azure Vault just really sucked. Every single one of them. Not a single good boss on Tyrannical Azure Vault. I think they were all bad. The third boss wasn't that... I should reiterate. The third boss wasn't that bad. The first boss, the big tree, sucked on Tyrannical. The second boss, with the mirror images and the arcane damage pulsing, really sucked on Tyrannical. And then Umbral Skull really sucked on Tyrannical. Neltharis. I think on Fortified, Neltharis was bad. But I think the bosses on Neltharis really, really sucked. And then the chain strat happened and existed. And I think that really, really just nuked the quality and playability and enjoyability of Neltharis. Neltharis was one of those keys where when I saw it, I was like, well, I'm fucking out of here. Algathar Academy, I'm going to put in A tier. I liked the stat buffs. I liked the stat buffs. I like the diversity in routing. You know what I didn't like, though? The bird. Kroth as a tank and Kroth as a Mistweaver healer, regardless of your tank, was just horrible, horrible on Tyrannical. Everything else was really cool, and the trash pulls you could pull in there were so rad. Algathar Academy, I think, is a really, really good dungeon, and it's kind of like the only one from Season 1 that's coming back and forth that I'm looking forward to. Neltharian's Lair, I'm going to put in A tier. B tier, I lied. I think Neuraxis on Tyrannical was just unforgivably tuned. And Neuraxis wasn't even fixed. Like, Neuraxis was just a poorly tuned boss all the way through. I think that depending on your group and on your comp, Rockmora on Tyrannical could be a bit of a stinker. I think the Pelters were just horrible. Otherwise, I don't think the dungeon was that bad. I think it was a perfectly fine dungeon. I think the reason that it's in B tier instead of A tier was because the timer was too lenient. You could wipe like 3 times after Rockmora, or 3 times after Dargrul. Ularog. You could wipe like 3 times after Ularog, or 3 times after Rockmora, and you could still easily, like, freely one-chest the dungeon. The timer was too forgiving. I think that's why Nelth's Lair deserves a B tier instead of an A. We got a selection left. Blackrock holds a B. I think that Blackrock Hold's tuning in Season 3 is really, really good. I think the ability to go either direction on the intro was a really, really good choice. I think the biggest problems are bursting and bolstering in there. just like an Everbloom, because things that you would think shouldn't be able to trigger those affixes do trigger those affixes, and it's kind of like, why? Just like Neltharion's Lair, I think the biggest thing putting Blackrook Hold from the A tier is that the timer is too lenient. You can wipe a couple or a few times anywhere in the dungeon and still very comfortably one-chest that dungeon. That's really all I've got to say about Blackrook. It's a fine dungeon. It was one of the tyrannical stinkers back in Legion, but I don't think it's too oppressive or offensive now. Darkheart Thicket I've got in D. I think the bosses all suck on tyrannical. They're very unfun, and I think some of the trash is really just too punishing for it just doing random whatever it wants on Fortified. The timer's also... I think the timer's fairly lenient, but I just don't like how the dungeon functions mechanically compared to a lot of the other dungeons we've seen. I think it's too punishing on one affix and still too punishing on the other affix. Darkheart Thicket is kind of a stinker. I mean, thematically, it was a good dungeon to bring back this season, but I think it didn't do well. I think it was just as bad now as it was then, but then it might have been worse. I'm not sure. D tier Darkheart. Brackenhide Hollow I have as a B tier. I played 7 different specs. I got Keystone Hero on 7 different specs in Season 2. And I think Brackenhide Hollow was probably one of the more enjoyable dungeons of the season, with the changes they made from Mythic 0 to Keystone Dungeon that they made going into Season 2 for Brackenhide. I think Brackenhide ended up being a really fine Mythic Plus dungeon. Brackenhide, I'm kind of excited to come back just because in Season 2 it really wasn't all that bad between like various Death Knight, Arms Warrior, Evoker at all, Shadow and Disc Priest. I played a lot in Season 2, and Brackenhide Hollow was a dungeon that I actually kind of enjoyed. I didn't have many issues with or many complaints about it. Compared to Uldaman Legacy of Tyr. The dungeon felt really, really long, and the bosses I felt were so badly tuned. It didn't matter if it was Fortified or Tyrannical, the bosses were so dog water. Especially if you didn't have an Evoker. Especially Sentinel Talandris, I think. The boss with the bleed and the orbs you gotta kite him through, and if you didn't have a tank that knew how to kite him through the orbs, that dungeon, it was terrible. It was so bad. Legacy dungeon returning, Atal Dazar, I'm gonna put in B tier. And the reason I'm going to put Atal Dazar in B tier is because if you don't have a player that knows what to do on Volcall, that boss is going to suck. If you don't have a player that knows what to do on Priestess, that boss is going to suck. And they will eat your keys. When you do a 13 Atal Dazar and someone doesn't know to stand in the blood puddles, and Priestess ends up being like a 6-minute fight, you kind of get a bad taste for the dungeon as a whole, and that boss. The same thing applies to the totems on Volcall. And then the changes to Yasma to make Racking Pain undispellable and uninterruptible was just so bad. On Tyrannical, it does way too much damage. They didn't fix the issues with Soul Echoes, or Soul Rend doing too much damage, and the ads having to deal with the ads and too many spiders all over the place. The spiders one-shotting you. And then my favorite jank in Atal Dazar is people not having a fucking clue where they're going on Razan. People will get pursued by Razan and go in any random fucking direction, and then they'll still get caught, they'll still die, and then before you know it, we've got like 7 skeletal raptors up just eating your tank or other people if your tank doesn't aggro them. I think it's a fine dungeon. I just think it's not greatly tuned and not greatly designed for a seasonal game with people just kind of hopping in. We're not coming off the backs of a successful expansion. We're coming off the backs of a bad one where people are playing for like half to 2/3 of a season, dipping out, and we've got new players coming in a season. A Tal Dazar is not a new player-friendly dungeon. And unfortunately, that just loses it a ton of points. I'm only putting it in B tier because it is, for people who know what to do, it is a fine dungeon that is mechanically and mostly tuning-wise pretty sound. But for new players and returning players who didn't play in BFA, a Tal Dazar is a huge stinker. Vortex Pinnacle I have in C tier. Here's my reasoning. I think tuning-wise, on Tyrannical, Vortex Pinnacle sucked. I think mechanically, some of the mechanical adjustments they made to make it a Mythic Plus dungeon, I think kind of sucked. Looking at you, Alteris. But I think, as a whole, for the Vortex Pinnacle, I think the changes made alone from Cataclysm regular heroic dungeon to Dragonflight Mythic Plus dungeon, I loved the changes. If you compared Cata heroic Vortex Pinnacle to Dragonflight Season 2 Vortex Pinnacle, you would be looking at like 2 different dungeons that happen to just have the same environment. I think the Mythic Plus changes were great. It was just kind of poorly tuned in some spots. Freehold, fan favorite. Freehold was a great dungeon. I hated the whole captain change because I think a big part of Freehold's identity was having a different captain, and I think their choice to have Eudora as one of the captains was kind of a caca one. It was kind of yucky, but I think overall the dungeon was pretty fucking rad. Same goodness as it was in seasons 1 through 4 of BFA. Mostly 4. Freehold's a good dungeon. Definitely enjoyed it. The Underrot, A tier. So let's discuss the Underrot. I think the biggest problem with the Underrot was its tuning on Tyrannical. I think on Fortified it was a really, really solid dungeon, but on Tyrannical, Kragmaw was just as bad as it was in BFA. It was horrible. Always has been horrible. The last boss, if people didn't listen to you or know what to do, was really, really tedious. And then there was Spore Caller Sancha, I think it was called. Spore Caller had a little bit of jank and wasn't great tuned on Tyrannical. Other than that, the dungeon was really good. Only thing keeping it from S is that jank tuning. And the only thing keeping it from S tier is that jank tuning, as well as, just like a couple of other dungeons that are in the B tier, Neltharian's Lair and Blackrockhold, the timer on Underrot was really, really free. You could probably feasibly wipe on like every boss at least once, and the dungeon is still comfortably timeable. But the Underrot was a really nice dungeon to see return with the tuning adjustments that they made, but unfortunately the tuning was still a bit off. Then you got Halls of Infusion. Halls of Infusion's a bad dungeon, man. The gauntlet at the end sucked. The last boss sucked. The jank on the third boss sucked. The first boss kind of sucked. The trash in there sucked. There isn't much redeemable. There's one redeeming quality to Halls of Infusion. It dropped a really good trinket for some people, but that redeeming quality is also one of its biggest downfalls, because like Unholy Death Knights and Augmentation Evokers were required to do Halls of Infusion for that trinket. The dungeon's just big bad. That's really all I gotta say about it. And this is my tier list for all of the Mythic Plus dungeons that have appeared and the 8 that will appear for all of Dragonflight. So leave your thoughts, comments, and concerns and flame in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next tier list. The next one we're going to do is Mythic Plus affixes.